I'm Mr. Ramsey, saving Western civilization, one student at a time.
In this episode, we'll be discussing the aftermath of World War I, especially focusing on the Versailles Treaty that Germany signed. Because Germany thought they were signing on to a treaty that was going to have peace without victors, or better yet, based on Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, but finds out when they sign it, it's a punitive peace. A peace that they, the German people, have to pay. So, it was supposed to be a peace without victors, but it became a peace with victors. So, if you remember, the United States entered the war in 1917, actually April of 1917, while the Russians were falling out. Okay? And when the Germans knocked the Russians out in roughly of 1918, the winter of 1918, they take all their forces from the Eastern Front, and they move it to the West. And when they do that, when the Germans do that, they make their big push in the summer of 1918 to try to win the war. And they failed. And the reason why they failed is because the Americans got there just in time to save the day for the Allied powers. So, when it's all said and done, November 9th, 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicates his throne, gives it to the German people, or the German High Command of the army, and then they surrender 2 days later on November 11th at 11:11 a.m. It was a ceasefire, an armistice, if you will. So the armistice is declared, and then you have peace agreements in Paris, the peace talks. What are they going to do with these four Central Powers? And Germany and the rest of the Central Powers believe that it's going to be based on Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. When the United States entered the war, Woodrow Wilson drew up 14 points that he thought they should be, the peace of Europe should be based on. And those 14 points include freedom of the seas, where every nation has access to the seas. That's the first point, but the British are going to disallow that one. The second point is to limit arms, which actually happens in the 1920s. You have treaties which is going to limit the arms of all the nations of the world. Okay? The third point was the end of secret alliances, because when the Bolsheviks took over Russia, they started printing out all these secrets that the Tsar and the Tsar government had done with these secret alliances that embarrassed the Western powers, England, France, and the Italians. All these promises that these guys made to the Russians, and actually through their secret treaties, and it was embarrassing. So, because they were promising, hey, if we win the war, we're going to divide up the Ottoman Empire this way, and Russia will get Constantinople. So, one of the major points that Woodrow Wilson wanted to do was no secret treaties. Okay? And then he also argued that they need, in his point 4, was to reduce all armaments, to reduce the arms of nations, the military arms. Okay? And then point 5 was to adjust all colonial claims. Okay? So they should have a understanding of who has what in the colonies. And then point 6 was that the Germans had to evacuate all of Russian territory, and the Russians should decide what type of government they have, and some of those people that are not Russian, that is under the Russian territory, should be allowed to self-determine what type of government they have. And so one of the key aspects of Woodrow Wilson is self-determination, where the nationalities should determine what government they should have. Okay, so you're going to see that. You also see that with Belgium, in the sense that Woodrow Wilson, in the 14 points, tells the Germans that they have to leave Belgium, leave it unoccupied, so they can self-determine what kind of government they have. The same thing with France. Germany has to give up Alsace-Lorraine, give it back to France, and one of those 14 points. In addition to that, the Italians should, all Italians should be under one nation, as you can see, as a self-determination. Self-determination. All Italians should be under one government. And then, if you look at the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, he said that all the people of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire should actually split up into different countries because they should be self-determined. All right. He also argues in the 14 points. This is Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. Serbia should be evacuated. The Ottoman Empire should be have its own determination, self-determination, and then the Polish state. There should be a Polish state. These are all in the 14 points. Okay, but the key concept of the 14 points are: number one, self-determination. Nationalities should self-determine who or what is going to lead their people, their nationality. Number two, okay, freedom of the seas. Number three, reduce of arms. Number four, no secret alliances. Okay? And then the big one, besides self-determination, is there should be a League of Nations to talk and discuss problems without going to conflict. And that's what that's the goal of the League of Nations. These are all the 14 points that Woodrow Wilson tries to emulate in the Peace of Paris. Now, there are four major people that are going to be playing the role in this Peace of Paris who's determining what's going to happen. What's going to happen to these Central Powers. Remember, the Central Powers are Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. Okay, and the big four that's going to determine what kind of policy is going to happen to these Central Powers are Woodrow Wilson for the United States, the David Lloyd George, Prime Minister of Great Britain, George Clemenceau, Prime Minister of France, and Vittorio Orlando, the Prime Minister of Italy. And they are going to want to change those 14 points. They see that Woodrow Wilson, they being those other three, David Lloyd George, Clemenceau, and Orlando, think that Woodrow Wilson is an idealist and he shouldn't be listened to. George Clemenceau wants to make Germany pay for this war. So what's going to happen is Woodrow Wilson's going to sacrifice all his different ideas except for one, and that's the League of Nations, and also the self-determination idea. To get his League of Nations, he's going to allow Clemenceau and the French to make the Germans pay. And you see that in the Treaty of Versailles. And the Treaty of Versailles is the treaty. There's going to be 5 treaties that the Central Powers sign, one for each country. And the Treaty of Versailles is the treaty that the Germans sign. And they signed that treaty on June 28th, 1919, the same day that Archduke Francis Ferdinand was assassinated. And in the Treaty of Versailles, it says a couple of things. Number one, that Germany is responsible for the war. It's their responsibility. That's the reason why they went to the war, and they should pay. And that's called the War Guilt Clause. And we'll hear that again when it comes up to World War II. Okay? Germany also can't have, under the Treaty of Versailles, Germany can't have a draft. They have to reduce their army, I believe, to 100,000 soldiers. They are banned from manufacturing new weapons. They have to return Alsace-Lorraine. They can't have any more colonies. They have to allow the French to control the Saar region, which is a region where it has coal mines, for 15 years. The Allies get to occupy the Rhineland, and that Rhineland is on the border of France and Germany, and there's supposed to be no military presence in that section in the Rhineland. Okay? They have to renounce the Brest-Litovsk Treaty that they signed in Russia, they being Germany. Germany signed a treaty, if you remember, called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. They have to cancel that treaty, and they're going to make Poland a new nation out of German, Russian, and Austrian-Hungarian territory. And they actually have to give part of Germany to Poland to make this thing called the Polish Corridor. So that's the Treaty of Versailles. All the other powers have to sign treaties too. Austria has to sign a treaty called the Saint-Germain-en-Laye, which is the Austrians basically allowing them to create Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. And I'll talk about Yugoslavia in a second. The Ottoman Empire has to sign the Sèvres Treaty. I'm saying the Sèvres Treaty. And Bulgaria has to sign the Neuilly Treaty. And they all have to agree to the demands of the Allies and the Big Four of Woodrow Wilson, David Lloyd George, George Clemenceau, and Victorio Orlando. Okay? So, after this happens, Austria-Hungary is broken up into different countries. You have the Polish Corridor. You have this idea called self-determination. And you're going to have new nations that are going to develop. Finland from Russia, the Baltic states, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. And one thing I want to talk about Yugoslavia is Serbia becomes the big winner out of all this war. Because if you remember, Galileo Princip assassinated Archduke Francis Ferdinand for Greater Serbia. And guess what Serbia got? They got Yugoslavia. Okay? And there's going to be some heated tension in the 1920s and early 30s because of what the Big Four did to Europe, and especially Germany under the Treaty of Versailles. Okay? But I want you to just keep in mind that Yugoslavia was the big winner, or Serbia was the big winner in this war. Okay? Most people were losers. All right. That's all I have for World War I. I will see you and talk to you about the 20s under fascism and communism in my next episode. Thanks for listening.
Al suon della campana mattutina si sveglia il sole con i raggi d'oro. Mi affretto per andare all'officina, luce di vita, fonte di lavoro. I miei balilla dormono ed il mio